Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses. I thank Chairman Lukemeyer for holding today's hearing. Pretty critical issue, the approach we take in regulating the flow of capital into China. I do support the approach taken by Mr. Barr's bill, H.R. 760, which employs a scalpel-like approach in addressing the complex issue of sanctions. I do think focusing on a clearly defined areas of risk, H.R. 760 ensures that investments to U.S. investors are not inadvertently hindered and doesn't give Europeans or the rest of the world, for that matter, a free pass. So, Mr. Feddo, you led CFIUS effectively during your time in the Trump administration. Can you elaborate why setting up a type of new-bound investment plan would create a new regime, would create more bureaucracy than using the tools of the Office of Foreign Asset Control as described in Mr. Barr's bill?
Thank you, Mr. Mueser. Let me just say, whatever Congress legislates, there will be resource costs associated with it. My view, articulated in my written testimony, is that in creating yet another regulatory regime, instead of relying on existing regimes, existing definitions, existing infrastructure, a huge institutional wealth of institutional knowledge and experience at OFAC and other parts of the U.S. government that have been implementing and administering sanctions for a very long time, instead of leveraging that and having an efficiency factor and an immediacy to what the Congress does, drafting new regulations, redefining terms, explaining and scoping what a sector like artificial intelligence is, it's incredibly difficult. And it will take more resources and more time than I think the administration or the Congress expects. And if we really want to attack this problem as quickly as possible, a bill like Mr. Barr's bill does that right away and leverages work that the government has already done identifying entities of concern. Furthermore, sanctions have this ripple effect that we talked about. One that's really important, I didn't get to mention from my testimony, is this idea of the 50% rule. If a party is blocked, any entity or JV that it has 50% or more ownership interest in is also blocked by operation of law. That has a huge effect on affiliates and subsidiaries of the named entity. Whereas, for example, in the CMIC sanctions, there's no 50% rule, and it has little effect. So there are ways to do this without reinventing the wheel and spending an immense amount of time drafting regulations that will inherently be confusing for the private sector.
Thank you. Mr. Ashu, the private sector has been reacting. What are your thoughts on the so-called de-risking, as we put it, as opposed to decoupling, as well as investors' attitudes the last couple of years towards China as far as foreign investment goes?
Sure. We've seen the de-risking happening. It's happening because it's apparent to anybody investing in China that the risks have gone up. I mentioned Hong Kong as a very sobering example of how the Chinese approach to economics has changed. We see human rights violations without peer in the Xinjiang province, and the U.S. took action to deal with that, but those infractions still continue. So it's not getting any better. And I think that in the case of, in particular, private industry, on whom the U.S. government relies for U.S. policy to be effective. Remember, in the case of financials or technology, those two areas are so broad and vast. The U.S. government can't possibly implement the policy on its own. It needs the cooperation of industry. And in the case of de-risking, there are many ways serving U.S. policy for us.
Okay. So looks like China's certainly lacking in capital investment. Do you feel that they'll be able to make up for it, or do you see a downward trend in China manufacturing as well as their economic viability?
So obviously their system is not a capitalist one, and it's difficult to predict. But I will say this: the answer has a lot to do with what the U.S. does.
And I'm sorry, I'm over time. We'll talk later. Sure. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.